just to underline that we are recording this evening for posting later on the Future Fit Homes website. So if you don't want to be recorded, switch your video off and rename yourself, and that's fine. But meanwhile, welcome everyone to this, the second of our webinars on retrofitting conservation areas. And during these weeks of COP26, which have been concentrating our minds on the desperate urgency of emissions reduction and climate adaptation, we trust these webinars offer a timely forum for discussion and guidance towards practical actions for those who care for older buildings. And I'm Julia Rowntree, Chair of Brook Mill Road Conservation Area Society. And for those of you who are new to the webinars this evening, this area represents a small ensemble of streets featuring rare unity and consistency, particularly of roofscape in the north of Brockley Ward, Lewisham. And in fact, it was the first the second area to be designated after Blackheath, which is, of course, much more famous than we are, but a note of our significance. We initiated these webinars so we could learn more about how to address adaptation challenges whilst protecting the heritage qualities of our houses. And we're delighted to have been working with South London Community Energy, and particularly Nadia, to whom a huge thanks for all the work she's put into it, on preparation and hosting of the webinars. And we're delighted to welcome our speakers and panelists today from Historic England, Retrofit Action for Tomorrow, Lewisham Council and CELSI. And thanks to all of you for your time and commitment. We're delighted we have in attendance this evening representatives from amenity societies in Lewisham, Greenwich and further afield, together with architecture and conservation professionals and individual homeowners from South London and different parts of the country. So in our first webinar, Exploring Policy and Context with CELSI and Historic England, we gained valuable insights, including the challenge of adapting older housing stock is inevitably significant. We were, however, alerted to a more optimistic way of looking at this. In the context of the London Plan, for example, and route to net zero, the easily identifiable older housing stock of conservation areas could be regarded as a priority and potentially a target for expenditure of London offset funds. Optimistic, perhaps, but a policy idea worth pursuing and indeed lobbying for, as would be reduction to zero for VAT on retrofit works. There's a renewal of interest in traditional building methods and materials as adaptive and with low embedded carbon. One of our speakers said the aesthetic of net zero architecture is in fact the aesthetic of existing building stock, given that new construction is one of the heaviest emitters. We also heard from all speakers that a whole house approach, i.e. fitness of the existing fabric, effective insulation, occupancy and use, must be addressed and taken into consideration first before installation of new heat pumps and so on. But luckily in South London, we have Future Fit Homes as a resource to help us through the option stress of embarking on our own practical solutions. So I'll hand over now to Nadia of CELSI, and Future Fit Homes is a division of CELSI, just to be clear, project manager, to introduce tonight's first speaker. Nadia.
Thanks very much, Julia, for that introduction. So as mentioned, South East London Community Energy, who some of you are very familiar with, is a community energy group working across Lewisham, Greenwich, Bromley and Southwark boroughs, and a few other areas of South East London. Future Fit Homes is one of our newest projects, which is supporting homeowners to go green through domestic retrofit. And we're really, really glad to be working with Brook Mill Road Area Conservation Society and a group of other conservation area societies across South East London, because we think this is a really, really important topic for homeowners of of conservation area homes. So without further ado, let's get straight into Harry's presentation. He is going to be looking at a deep dive into retrofit, and he has a wealth of experience. We're very glad to have him speaking today. So Harry Paticus is an architect and a founder of Retrofit Action for Tomorrow, which I'm sure he will tell you a little bit more about. He's a certified passive house designer and a technical expert for the AECB, the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Association, and the Passive House Trust. So he has a wealth of experience in this area. He's got over a decade of deep retrofit experience in a range of historic and modern buildings, from Georgian townhouses right through to a self-build in Walter's Way House in Lewisham. So very local guy, very relevant experience. And we'll be glad to hear about more about those projects in just a moment. So through Retrofit Action for Tomorrow, RAFT, Harry is currently working on 3 primary school retrofit projects in Lewisham, and he's a hands-on DIY retrofitter, currently working on his own whole house retrofit to the Passive House Benefit Standard in Honor Oak. So without further ado, I'll pass straight on to Harry.
Nadia, thank you so much for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you, albeit on Zoom. I hope you all have a really kind of informative evening and look forward to questions afterwards. So I'm gonna share my screen, and I'd like a thumbs up from Nadia that's nice and clear, just that I know. Yeah, excellent. So yeah, so I'm Harry Paticus. I've gone with the title that Celsi gave me, diving into deep retrofit. So let's do it. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting word, diving in. I'm not sure we should all be diving straight into deep retrofit, and my talk actually suggests that perhaps we should be a bit more cautious. And I will talk about ways in which we should be doing that. But this is going to be a sort of a very intense 20 minutes, so get ready. So very briefly, Raft is about 1 to 2 years old, and I moved from a previous company, Arboreal Architecture, where I was for over 12 years, to Raft, and my mission really was to try and scale up retrofit, because I've been working on a lot of individual houses and I really wanted to make a bigger difference. So Raft is about deep retrofit. It's also about school engagement and engagement with communities. And it's also about looking at how both buildings and operations can move towards zero carbon. So one head teacher that I've spoken to told me that she thought she might better reach about 5,000 people through the school community. So we thought we'd actually do a drawing of what that looks like. And of course, all of us are somewhere on this drawing, either as staff, local services, we have children in schools, or we supply schools in some way. We're connected. And I think the sort of fundamental idea of Raft is that we can actually implement retrofit in schools, and then we can also influence retrofit in homes through that action. So we've been giving workshops to children, to staff at schools, and then we're also connecting with families. So I'm going to be talking about whole house retrofit. And this slide summarizes some of the range of buildings that we've worked on. And these include listed buildings, mid-terraced houses, and you'll be hearing from the one that says 1901 from Sarah in a bit, and I'm very excited to hear her talk. I'm actually in this 1978 one. That's me on the balcony, but right now I'm up in this room up here on the right. And that's in Lewisham in Honor Oak. This is a Walter's Way house, this 1988, a self-build house, many of you might know, if any of you are in Lewisham. And on the right is a house in Kentish Town in a conservation area next to a grade 2 listed building. And that was built in 2012 and is unfortunately pretty substandard construction and needs a retrofit itself. So we're not just retrofitting older buildings, we're also retrofitting newer buildings. So very briefly, this is a grade 2 building. If anybody's interested in finding out more about this, if you type in fitness fanatics and onto the CIBSE website, there's a lot of information there about it, quite detailed. I learned nearly everything I know about retrofit through this project, which was designed 10 years ago. So it's a semi-detached 4-story townhouse. And we met the AEC Silver Standard. This is in a conservation area. It's grade 2 listed, both the curtilage and the interior, and it had lots of historic features which we worked around. So there's a very bespoke solution for every room. So we used a mixture of insulation materials, all of them vapor open, so all of them able to breathe, able to transfer heat and moisture, you know, in the form of vapor, so that it wasn't building up anywhere in the construction. And we've also, Historic England have actually got a weather station on the roof of this property and have been gathering data for a long time. And I've personally got 20 sensors in it as well. So we've actually been looking at how it's performed hygrothermally over many years. This is, I was going to talk about this project, but because Sarah's talking about it later, I'm substituting it for another mid-terraced house in a conservation area, this time in West London. This is Linton Road. And this was a retrofit to the Passive House standard. Very sensitive to the streetscape. I don't think you can tell at all that anything has changed to this building. It actually has triple glazed windows at the front, but it's pretty seamless. And we have internal wall insulation at the front, and we have external wall insulation at the rear. And then this is my house. So this is actually work in progress. I do have visitors. We do arrange visits sometimes to this. It's quite good because you can see what's going on. You can see it's sort of still halfway through construction. But this is en route to becoming an Enefit project. It's the UK's first step-by-step Enefit project, and we've used cork insulation, which has the lowest embodied carbon of the insulation materials. But we've also installed a whole range of different materials, including materials that might be very relevant for historic properties, such as diathanite screed and insulation, which is a lime-based, lime and cork-based insulation that is also vapor permeable. And in fact, we're going to be doing a trial soon with a company called Thermalon, who we're partnering at the moment in a Innovate UK smart grant bid. And they make a low carbon version of aerogel, and they're mixing it with a lime plaster, and they're going to be launching a new aerogel lime plaster onto the market. So this is a really interesting material. I think will be very relevant to a lot of historic retrofit. And then Walter's Way. Here we've actually installed triple glazing. We've installed almost seamlessly external solar shading. These buildings were self-built and people went for it with windows. They just thought they'd do full width windows, but it obviously overheats. So we've actually installed this external solar shading. And we've also got a decentralized Mvhr system. This is the Lunos system, EGO, and it's basically regenerative. It's called regenerative heat recovery. So it's a good solution for historic buildings, but it does depend on the arrangement, the layout of the house. So it's certainly working well at the moment. They're very small units, so you don't have pipe work everywhere to have to deal with. And I'm just showing this briefly because just today we got planning approval to install double glazing in this grade 2 listed building in Bayswater. We weren't sure if we would get it, but we're installing the double glazing into these units. There's a number of non-original elements of glass, but it's just very interesting to see that Westminster Planning are approving slimline double glazing replacement on listed buildings. So just thought I'd share that. So I thought it would be helpful in this deep dive to talk about the steps to retrofit, steps that we think are needed in order to understand buildings sufficiently to warrant intervening into the way in which they've always worked. So this gives you a sense of the kinds of observations we want to make. We will go through and we will be looking at water pressure, wall finishes, different building elements. We'll also use a thermographic camera and we'll pick out thermal bridges. We might occasionally on bigger properties start to do a more of a quinquennial inspection approach where we look very carefully at each of the building elements and descriptions. And then we'll start to look at how are all those elements sort of arranged around the building and what's the hierarchy of importance of them. And we also need nearly always to carry out opening up works. We find that if you don't open up, you're going to have too many surprises. So a sort of targeted opening up we find incredibly helpful. And occasionally we can't get onto roofs. So in this particular case, we went to the local fire station and we actually gave them a bit of money for their charitable fund, and we gave them a camera and they actually went to the top of the ladder and took this photograph of the roof on the right. So sometimes you have to go to extraordinary lengths. And I have to say, this was 10 years ago. I think now a drone might be a bit easier, but it was fun. So we're quite often doing this, looking under floorboards, trying to work out what's going on. And this slide here is really a reminder that things are not always as they seem. So this is a late 19th century mid-terraced Victorian house. And it looked like it had a kind of limey internal plaster. Nothing that would suggest that the whole wall has got this rather peculiar damp-proof system with this sort of corrugated plastic sheet with a big layer of gloop over the top of it. And some more experienced surveyors may well have seen this before, but when we came across this, we were really surprised. And of course, this was covering all the walls. So we do also do targeted opening up of plaster on all the external walls so that we know what we're dealing with. And likewise for the external walls on the outside face, in this case, we had a really hard cement render that was actually locking a lot of moisture into those walls. And on the other side of this wall, all the joists were rotting, and that was because all the moisture was being held in that wall. So changing that to a vapor open lime render would actually improve the wall health immensely. Funny enough, I was with somebody from Historic England when I took this photograph, and we all got very excited because it was a live overflowing hopper shedding water down a wall. And this is on the Clapham retrofit project that I mentioned earlier. And we actually put a sensor into this wall soon after work started on site. And it really did take 3 years to dry out. So this kind of neglect, you can even see a bit of buddleia there. This kind of neglect really does take a long time to rectify. So just want to flag that sorting out rainwater goods and drying out your building is part of the retrofit process. It should be thought of part of the retrofit process. And then finally, we started to sort of think more about how building elements relate to when they're installed. And it's really important to think of buildings as very layered structures, often with problematic materials, often with asbestos thrown in at different periods. And obviously it's really critical to pick that up at an early stage. But also this kind of thinking, perhaps Sarah will touch on it a bit later, led into our approach about how we might think about embodied carbon and the history of carbon in the building, both in terms of the history of burning coal and the enormous carbon emissions from that, and all the way through now to putting on solar PV or having an air source heat pump and decarbonised heat sources. So in terms of the design approach, we use Design PH, which is a passive house planning tool. And it's actually incredibly accurate. we've actually built things, and then we've tracked the energy use, and we've been within a few percent. And often the variability is probably more to do with the climate. So we found it a really, really useful tool. It's ever so slightly conservative. So on my house, it's actually performing ever so slightly better than it's supposed to be. So we've also developed a technique where we can do a rendering in this software to show where are the highest areas of heat loss. And so a bit like a thermographic view. So this is also quite useful. And I can kind of imagine an aerial view of the Brook conservation area, looking at where are these higher areas of heat loss. And of course, single glazing would be one of them, uninsulated roofs, another. So we also think about air tightness and all the junctions around that, and where there might be tricky junctions that need to be resolved to try and get tricky junctions between the main roof and the rear roof, and how to deal with that junction between the two. Also thinking about phasing. Not everybody has the money to do the works in one go, me for one. And so phasing is incredibly tricky. It means moving things around your house. It means working out how to store things. It means thinking about overlapping activities, you know, the relationship of windows to walls. But there's a little piece of software in the step-by-step Enefit guide that is actually really helpful. It's really good because it forces you to think about the longevity of building elements, and it forces you to think about interrelationships between building elements. So we're also on a school level thinking about how that phasing takes place, and also how the phasing takes place in relation to having some form of on-site PV generation. So this is St Winifred's Primary School. This is a construction timeline for that project. So on the bottom left, there's a little graph. This is a simple historic retrofit project. And we're showing what the existing space heat demand is of about 180 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. And then we're looking at what step one, some internal wall insulation might do, and then an upgrade to the windows. And then step three, in this case, was Mvhr with a strategy of air tightness. You know, Mvhr isn't always the right solution. It might be demand controlled mechanical extract ventilation. It might be a decentralized Mvhr, but we do find that Mvhr, when it's easy to install, can be a really great solution. It does deliver really, really good air quality. And we're sort of finding that for classrooms and schools, that's even more the case. So these are some holes and pipes that inside my house that I drilled. So there are different systems of Mvhr, just to let you know. There's a branch system, and then there's a radial system. So the radial system is actually a little bit easier to thread through a house. They're thinner pipes, so you can sort of do weaving on a grand scale. And this is me with my son looking at our Mvhr unit that we even hung on the wall, did everything, including all the taping of these ducts going to the outside. And that's what it does in the house. It sort of snakes through between floorboards and the like. And I thought my son did an even better drawing. This is him trying to understand how Mvhr works and how the testing of it worked. We've also been doing a series of very, very detailed sections. And I think it's very important to remember that deep retrofit does need detail thinking. So it has the strategic level of the space heat demand and the thermal performance of the building. But then we need to zoom in and understand these different details. So these are details that I've drawn by hand for my house. Then a quick note about windows. So triple glazing, sliding sashes. They're quite heavy, but they do look good and they do perform well. But also internal secondary glazing, either as a single glazing, or as Pilkington Spacier vacuum glazing could be a really high-end version of secondary glazing. And these are some photographs from a colleague of mine's project, Bisley, in central London. And then here there's some secondary glazing that you can barely tell on the left-hand side that it's in, and there on the right it's opened up. So it's one single large plane. and this is selector glaze. So the windows also lead to overheating. So let's not forget that retrofit should also be addressing issues of climate breakdown and increased heating and increased overheating in the summer. And there's a really nice little tool, an early stage overheating risk tool by the Good Homes Alliance, and we sometimes use that as a very early guide. And that's on the right. I think it's a free to download tool. It's quite a useful thing. And just a little note to say that I've developed my own bespoke window shades in my house that I rig up each year. So they're very, very easy to install. It's quite fun to do, and I do it just whenever there's a heat wave, and they work incredibly well. And I think it's worth noting that there are some absolutely amazing window shade covers, awning covers, still in existence on a lot of buildings around London. You can, if you start to know what to look for, you start to see them everywhere. And of course, London was covered in external solar shading at one point in time. It was very, very common. There were a lot of manufacturers that were producing all sorts of different types. So in terms of post-construction, we do install sensors in buildings, not every one, and I think now I've got a very good sense of how these retrofits are going to perform. But we developed a technique of wireless sensors linked to a gateway, and then we would spread them around the building so that we could understand how were the different elements we were installing going to perform. And then we can sit down on a computer with a client and talk about it and understand it. And in some cases, it was certain parts of the house were getting a bit hot, and we started to talk about stack effect ventilation and opening a window at lower level and a window at high level to sort of drag the air through. But in other cases, it was about slightly higher moisture levels in one area where there was a dryer kind of working continuously. So we managed to adjust the ventilation to adapt to that. So I thought this graph would be interesting. This is a number of years. It's 2 years per vertical line. So this is a sensor behind some wood fiber insulation in the wall getting wet during the winter and then drying out in the summer, then getting wet in the winter. And this is basically rainwater on the external wall driving moisture inwards, but it dries out. And as you can see, it is drying out over time. But buildings do take a long time to dry out. Brickwork really does take a long time to do that. So then this is a way of, that's my 20 minutes, my little reminder. I'm going to be wrapping up shortly, so don't worry, Nadia. So this gives a sense of what kind of savings can be made at each of the retrofit steps. And as I said earlier, we're actually lower on my house personally than where we should be. So that's very encouraging. And I really want to end on a kind of observation about the Brook Mill conservation area and how the houses are very often in a terrace of 4, 6 or 8 houses, and we're probably built in that way. And I think it would be, it's very hard to do this, but I think it would be a really fascinating way of thinking about it, to think about it on a kind of group buying process, and to think about, is it possible to start to do, let's say, an exemplary terrace that might then be something that everybody else can learn from in the area. It's just that the delivery costs of some eco insulation materials can be quite high. It might be that there's a way of doing it step by step through all the houses where trades might work their way down a terrace. And I think there's probably quite a lot to explore there. And the reason for showing the Waters Way image on the left is because, well, that was self-build. And, you know, kind of what I'm doing is an element of self-build. And it's not for everyone, but I think it is also quite interesting to think about local builders or self-builders just starting some kind of DIY revolution. DIY skills are gradually getting lost. And I think it would be interesting to explore the possibility of people doing more work to retrofitting their own homes. So this is a small plug here and an invitation. So on Friday, we've got a 1-hour assembly to celebrate the work done by 6 Lewisham primary schools. And it's going to be the children telling us what they've done with Draught over the year, and what retrofit works are happening on their schools. So we cast them as journalists to go away and record what's been happening in your school. So we've also got Harriet Lamb from Ashton, giving us a live address from COP. So she's going to summarize what's happened in COP for us. Thanks very much, and we look forward to questions later on.
Thank you so much, Harry. That was brilliant. And the event looks really exciting on Friday, actually. It's lovely to see students getting involved in this work and understanding it and explaining it. So I think that's a really exciting project. So before we get stuck into the next presentation, and Harry will of course join us at the end for our panel discussion, we're going to do a few quick quiz questions just to find out who's here, what your interests are, and it will help us figure out what we should be thinking about when we want to hear from people on retrofitting conservation areas. What sort of backgrounds are you coming from? So I hope that everyone can access the chat section, and if you can access the chat section, first one there, please give me a thumbs up or a hello in the chat section so we can see that you're all here. Hello, Claire. Very quick on the keypad. Well done. So just to start off, the first question is, what is the main motivation for you to actually do retrofit? If you've got one that leads above everything else, please pop that in the chat. If you've got a few different motivations, please go ahead and put them in there, but maybe put your biggest one in capital letters. We really find it varies amongst people, but there are a few that I think come up as the most common motivations. Okay, so we've got some funny answers here. Right, so we've got climate emergency. I'm sure that is the big motivator for most of us, especially over the past year, over lockdown. We've been seeing the protests about climate emergency and a lot of our local authorities announcing that we are in a climate emergency, and that recognition there. We've got fuel poverty. That's a really interesting point. Not a term that I hear so much from residents who own their own homes, but an interesting one nonetheless. Rona says, make my old house warm, in capital letters. I think we can all empathize with that one. Heat loss through crappy windows, from Julia. And I think Julia is getting that sorted out. So great motivator there. Energy saving, climate emergency, CO2, comfort within our own homes. That is one that is coming up frequently as well. So we've got CO2, comfort, and reducing energy costs, not losing energy, reducing the amount of energy that we use. Someone who's come from outside of the UK, being warm for the first time since moving to the UK. I really empathize with you there, Donna. I grew up abroad in Egypt as well, and coming back to the UK was a bit of a shock for me. So thanks everyone for putting those answers in there. The next question I have for you is, out of the people that have tried to do their own retrofit projects, what has been the main challenge for you in actually getting that done? So I know that there are lots of different things that come up. As you saw in Harry's presentation, he's managed to get a lot done across different types of buildings, but he is an expert in the field. So maybe he's managed to overcome those challenges in a number of different ways. So we've got here, knowing where to start, the cost, information, questions around priorities, deciding what to do. So quite a few people just stuck in that rut of, where do I start, what do I do, who do I look to? That's a really interesting point. Finding the cash again, okay. Finding contractors with knowledge, from Wolfgang. That's a really interesting point, which I'm sure we're going to touch on later. Again, contractors, tradesmen, fear that you'll make the wrong decision and have to spend more money to get it right in the end. So the fear of not doing it properly the first time round. Okay. And the last question I have for you is, when you look for, since we were on the topic of information and finding out about this, when you look for information on this topic, where do you go? Apart from our webinars, of course, where do you head to? What's your main source of information? What have you found useful? If there are any websites, if there are any groups that you think are great, please pop them in the chat so we can find out a little bit more about them. The answers are slow on this one. Is no one finding information anywhere? So Julia says she would go to Historic England's resource guides now after the presentations. Which.com for major purchases. That's a good one. Liz says this is the first and the only source of information so far. Hopefully we encourage more people to put out information about this kind of stuff. DIY retrofitters, I follow quite a few of them on Instagram, but not many of them are focused on energy efficiency. The Letty Guide to Retrofit looks promising from Alan. Internet search engines. Okay, so it's really, really diverse answers here. Super homes, We Are Possible, manufacturers, Energy Saving Trust. Right, there's a huge amount. Great stuff. So we'll bear that in mind. Please keep putting your answers in there because it's great to just find out what everyone is looking at so we can share that later. Everything we've put in the chat today, we will also upload on the website so you can access it after the webinar and dig a little bit deeper if you want to. But I'm going to pass back to Julia now to introduce our next speaker, Sarah Freeman.
So thank you, Nadia. And I've now got great pleasure in introducing Sarah Freeman, who will speak about her own retrofit project in a late Victorian terraced house in Birmingham, in fact, but of course with many comparable features to those in London and elsewhere. Sarah works as an inspector of historic buildings and areas at Historic England, in the Government Historic Estates Unit and previously within the London Development Advice Team. Prior to that, she worked as a conservation officer at the London boroughs of Camden and Croydon and for the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings and the Theatres Trust. She also represents the Victorian Society on the Southern Synod Listed Buildings Advisory Committee of the United Reformed Church. Alongside building conservation, Sarah has a special interest in retrofitting traditional buildings and in 2019 embarking on her own deep retrofit project of a 1902 mid-terrace house in Bourneville, Birmingham. And she's now going to embark on telling us about that. That's great. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Julia. I'm just going to share my screen for everybody. Let me see if that works. Oh, there we go. How's that? Thumbs up.
Great, we've got you.
Great. Thank you very much, Julia. It's great to be talking to you all tonight. As Julia said, I work at Historic England. We are the public body that protects and champions England's historic environment. And those of you that could make it to the first webinar or have been able to watch it again, have already heard great presentations from my colleagues Joanne and Alfie about general approaches to retrofit and some of the policy context. This evening, I'm going to be talking to you in more of a personal capacity about my own retrofit project. This is a case study of a low carbon and conservation-led approach to a whole house deep retrofit that my husband and I have been working on for the last couple of years. I'm going to try and not go into too much technical detail, but instead try and give you a homeowner's perspective on what has felt like quite a journey. I'm going to cover our overall approach and key aims, how we went about making decisions, some of the steps and processes that we've been through, and what building works we actually did. Now, as some of the other speakers on the previous webinar and tonight have already made clear, when it comes to traditional buildings, there can be no one-size-fits-all approach. Almost every building and owner-occupier are different. I'm not therefore suggesting that all the works we did are necessarily going to be right for other buildings, but we did apply a set of key principles that hopefully are transferable, and I'll be finishing my talk by covering some of these. So as part of our overall approach, it was important to us to apply best practice conservation principles, making use of available guidance to undertake an achievable and pragmatic retrofit. We followed a whole house approach, as advocated by the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance and Historic England, and also wanted to keep the project as low in carbon as possible. We had 3 key aims. These were to conserve the building's significance, character, and historic fabric, improve its thermal performance as far as possible, and minimise embodied carbon. Now, with any building project, there are so many decisions to make, which can be a bit overwhelming. To help with this, we used a simple decision-making schedule. Now, here are the headings from that big table you can see in the background. Using this approach helped us to take a step back from things and think and go through a systematic process to making decisions. Just going to take you through one example, which is a simple decision of whether or not to move an internal door. So we went through these steps. Oh, sorry, the lights in the meeting room have just gone off. Thank you. Here's one example, yes, of whether or not to move an internal door. We went through these steps, which prioritises minimum intervention, considers alternatives, and applies each of our 3 key aims, as you can see here, which are heritage, thermal performance, and carbon. Before using this tool, we had changed our decisions on this project, on this item, lots of times. And as you can see, in the end here, we actually decided to do nothing. Now, you often hear about minimum intervention in a conservation context, but actually it's also very relevant to a low carbon approach, because almost everything you do to a building has some sort of carbon cost. Now, just to give you a quick overview of the site, the house was built 1901 to 1902 and sits on the edge of the Bourneville Village conservation area. Now, this is a remarkable suburban model village on the edge of Birmingham, laid out by the Cadbury family near their chocolate factory. It's based on Cadbury's ideas for social betterment through housing reform. Now, our house is not listed and it's not actually in the conservation area. The yellow line you can see is the boundary, but we didn't have additional planning considerations to take into account. But in our approach, we treated the building with the same level of respect as if it was in the conservation area in terms of its heritage value and significance. There are some characterful architectural features and detailing to the house, particularly to the front elevations. You can see here the bay window, timber porch, decorative string courses and mouldings around the first floor windows. Well, quite a lot of internal features have been lost through previous alterations. It does have some surviving internal features of interest, including a timber staircase, quarry tiles in the hall floor, and some original cornicing and plasterwork. The plan is fairly typical for a terraced house. It's got 2 rooms at each level in the main part of the house with an outrigger to the rear. It did have some problems. It's very drafty, cold, and expensive to heat, as I'm sure all of you that live in a traditional building can sympathise with. The services were very old and it needed a lot of maintenance, as this has been neglected for quite some time. The layout meant that the hall was very dark and there was no visual connection through the house, and particularly none to the rear garden. So, to the project, where did we start? First of all, we went to the local archives to do some historical research. I found original floor plans for almost every other house on the street, apart from our own, such as the way with archival research. We did find some historical maps, aerial photos, and the original builder's permit, which gave us an exact date for the house and a few other bits of useful information. We did a fair amount of opening up and investigation works, things like removing modern finishes, carefully lifting a few floorboards to inspect the voids below. This made the house a bit less livable, but it really helped inform our understanding of what was there. For example, we found these original floorboards under the modern finish, and even what looks like an original section of wallpaper that you can see there, which we thought was quite fun. So we also monitored the temperature and relative humidity quite simple to do, surprisingly so, using tiny tags to get some data and to understand seasonal variations in the house. We got some survey drawings done by a local surveyor to help us visualise things and start to play around with ideas. And most importantly, we lived in the house for at least a year. We were getting to know it, how we wanted to live in it, what the existing conditions were like, particularly in relation to comfort and how it felt at different times of day and in different seasons. We also did a few quick wins, things like installing LED lights and some basic draught proofing around doors, windows and chimneys. We eventually got round to preparing a detailed architect's brief. Now, I'm not saying that you have to engage an architect to do a retrofit project, but in this instance, we felt doing so would really help us realise what we felt were quite ambitious project aims, get good design and retrofit outcomes, and also help us hopefully to save some money in the long run. It took us some time to find the right architect, so someone who knew about retrofit, but also respected and understood traditional buildings, and who would be able to put up with us as clients. In the end, we found Harry Paticus, who just had a great presentation from. Before our architect started any design work, we front-loaded, and they front-loaded, a lot of survey work to increase our understanding of the building and to give a baseline against which to judge proposed changes. They did a detailed pre-retrofit survey. This helped to understand the site, its conditions and climate risk, the condition of the building fabric, structural issues and moisture risk. The diagram in the top right, I think you saw on Harry's presentation as well, this just shows all the moisture risk areas identified in blue. So important to understand these to inform what works are needed and the overall retrofit strategy. For example, whether a different approach is needed at more vulnerable areas. We also had an air tightness test done. You can see in the bottom left image. This is essentially test the air pressure through the front door by using a giant fan. It tells you how leaky the house is. Now, we knew this was quite poor, but the results confirmed this, and we're going to redo it now that the works have been largely completed. Our architects also undertook a whole load of more sophisticated modelling and analysis work. This included looking at space heat demand, i.e. how much energy it takes to heat the building, which we're aiming to reduce by around 60 to 70%. We also did some thermal imaging. Now, this is something that Nadia and David talked about at some length in the first webinar, and to some people it may seem fairly high tech. We actually did this ourselves using a fairly basic camera built into a mobile phone. To explain, the images, one on the left, the red and white areas, in case people aren't familiar with this, are hot, and blue and purple are cold. As you can see, there are coal patches around the edges and the tops of walls and of course the floor. I specifically want to point out this area that you can see up here. Now you can see a white hot pipe running down there, which is an uninsulated hot water pipe, and a very cold patch to the top left of the window. Now, this is an area we kept getting water running down the wall. We thought it was a leak, lifted up floorboards, upstairs, looked behind the bath panel, etc. We couldn't find anything. In the end, we realised it was actually where an old air brick was located, and we had no proper kitchen extract. So the hot air from the cooking was condensing on this cold area and creating water running down the wall. I'll come back to the air brick later on in the presentation. I just want to touch very briefly on whole life carbon, as it's been a really important consideration and influence on our decision making throughout the project. So the text you can see at the bottom is just an extract from the RIBA guide to embodied end carbon for architects. It just gives a nice summary of what's meant by whole life carbon, essentially as the combination of the building's operational and embodied carbon emissions. Also want to briefly mention the inventory of carbon and energy prepared by the University of Bath, which can help to give people an idea of the carbon content of different building materials. Now, in relation to whole life carbon, our architects carried out a life cycle assessment of the building works. If you want to know more about this, then Harry talks about this aspect of the project in a lot more detail in a talk he did as part of a Historic England conference in January that's available to view online, and I'll share a link at the end of the presentation. But essentially, they built a model to quantify all the materials in the house to map its whole carbon history. both in terms of embodied and operational carbon, including its original construction, layers of changes and future projections. This really allowed us to see our project within a bigger picture and think hard about the relationship of embodied and operational carbon. We wanted to try and reduce what's often called a carbon burp, which is when lots of embodied energy is used through building works done that are actually trying to reduce operational energy. There's a real balance here. So what works did we do? It took us some time to find a local contractor who could undertake the work. As has already been mentioned, this is a real critical barrier to delivering retrofit work. We were lucky to find a company specialising in insulation. We actually found them through a contact via a local community energy group. So it was fortuitous that we'd had those conversations with someone else locally who was doing a similar kind of thing. But anyway, the contractors, they were excited about the project and they have done some really high quality work, but it's fair to say that the extent and the range of works that we've done has been challenging for them at times. I'm just going to whiz through some of the works now to give you an idea. First of all, a big part of the work was maintenance and repair. Things like fixing gutters, repairing roof timbers and floor joists, but all fairly common problems in traditional buildings. We did have some more major structural issues that needed addressing. For example, we had to replace a defective steel beam, which we chose to do in timber, using a glue laminated beam, which has a lower embodied energy than steel. We also did things like installing French drains and repairing windowsills. We put in lots of internal insulation to floors, wall and the loft. We chose to do this mainly in wood fibre, as it's a natural breathable material, easy to work with, comes in lots of different forms and thicknesses, as you can see here. Also made the building a lot more airtight through draft proofing and air tightness taping. Now, this has been mentioned a few times in the chat already. There are issues with internal wall insulation, but in this case, lots of the original features had already been lost, so it was relatively straightforward, but it can be a problem if you wanted to preserve things like original cornicing. There are still ways of doing this in some instances. So for example, we did take off some skirting and reinstate them. We had one set of original window architraves that we carefully removed and have reinstated in front of the internal wall insulation. So it can be done, just needs care. As we're making the building a lot more airtight, we needed to compensate for this with a new mechanical extract ventilation system. You can see the fan unit in the bottom left, which operates continuously with humidity controlled grills in kitchens and bathrooms and trickle vents in windows and other rooms. We also renewed other services, including removing our gas boiler and wet heating system, disconnecting from the gas network and replacing with an electric infrared heating panel system, which are located on ceilings, and a smart hot water tank. We put in a new kitchen and a bathroom. As we were doing internal wall insulation in these areas, some of the elements were needing to come out anyway. Appreciate this is very disruptive, but we were able to reuse sinks and the toilet due to a huge amount of embodied energy involved in producing these and the fact that they were in perfectly good condition. We installed triple glazed windows. Now, all our original windows in the house had been lost. If they'd survived, we probably would have taken a different approach and wanted to have kept those. But anyway, the situation we were in is that the modern windows were really poor and at the end of their usable life. A triple glazing can be a bit controversial in terms of its embodied energy versus its operational energy saving when compared to double glazing. I've not got time to go into this, but just to say, in this instance, we felt it was right due to the really high performance of the units that we went for, and as well the noise reduction benefits, because it's a fairly busy road. It was tempting to try and take down whole walls to open up the interior. We actually felt this wasn't going to be right for us, and it had issues for all of our three key aims, in that we would lose historic fabric, unnecessary carbon, and make spaces that were larger and therefore required more energy to heat. So we actually made fairly minor changes, just tweaking a few doorways and adding an internal hallway window, which really increased the light levels and visual connections through the house. This is still work in progress. We're adding a small single-storey lightweight timber extension and an oriel window to the first floor back bedroom, just small changes that will really add to the character, quality and usability of spaces in the house and improve its connection with the garden. We've had a strong commitment to recycling and reusing what we could. This diagram, produced by Harry and Co, gives you an idea of our approach. Things like recycling old UPVC window frames, gave away our old kitchen on free cycle, just amazed at how much demand there was for this. Reusing building materials and other reclaimed items wherever possible. Here's just a few examples of stacked building materials in the garden ready for reuse. Some saved glass panes from the remove windows that are actually going to be reused in our timber extension, and some timber panel doors that we found locally on free cycle and have repurposed within our living room. So after covering some of the main areas of work, I'm just quickly going to take you through an example of our living room fireplace. It has a number of elements that just showcases the overall approach. So as you can see, this is a solid floor element within the wider suspended timber floor. So it's a potential cold bridge from below. Obviously we were insulating all around. We needed a slightly different approach here. Also issues with drafts coming down the open chimney flue. So we applied a lime screed on top of the earth and insulated with foam glass and cork. And you can see that happening in the image on the right. The chimney flue was infilled and filled with a lightweight expanded clay aggregate material, which allows air to circulate to manage moisture risk. And we capped them with new traditional style clay pots. And sourced locally produced quarry tiles from a nearby house for the hearth. We made a tile trim to go around the area of the quarry tiles from timber from the original sash boxes that actually had to come out when the new windows went in. It's really nice to be able to repurpose those materials and sourced a reclaimed Edwardian fire surround. Overall, there's a relatively low amount of embodied carbon to these works, but it really reduces the heat loss through the floor and the chimney flue, and it brings back character to the house where it had been lost. And the air brick that I mentioned earlier on, which was causing water to run down our walls, we've now repurposed as a candle holder. So lastly, just to take you through some of our key project principles, we appreciate that our approach isn't going to work for everybody, but hopefully some of the principles are transferable and can help influence decision making. Firstly, it's so important to do maintenance and repair works first, particularly when moisture issues are involved, as this can store up huge problems if you don't tackle them. Managing moisture risk has been absolutely at the forefront of our minds throughout the project. Tried to mitigate risk as much as we can through using things like breathable materials, minimising the thickness of wall insulation to 80 millimetres. Even doing so, we have some risk areas that we're closely monitoring. Linked to this is the need to provide adequate ventilation. Traditional buildings need to breathe. If you're going to insulate and make a building more airtight, you have to compensate with some kind of ventilation system. Now, it's possible to judge the environmental impact of materials to help choose lower carbon options. I mentioned in relation to whole life carbon earlier on about the inventory of carbon and energy, which is a great source of information. We wanted to move away from fossil fuels. This image is just to show that you don't need a coal fire or a log burner to still enjoy the effects of a traditional fireplace. And lastly, just to say there are lots of ways to reuse and recycle to minimise waste. My colleague Joanne talked about I think it was 40% of UK landfill comes from construction waste. But doing this can be really tricky. Even with our approach to recycling and reuse, we have generated 5 skips of non-recyclable waste, which is a little bit eye-watering. Final thoughts. It's important to say that despite having professional support, some specialist prior knowledge and an okay budget, the whole process has been really, really difficult. COVID's been very disruptive and we had our first baby in the middle of all of this. But even without these things, I think it would have been really hard. You might have noticed from some of the works that we've done quite a bit of it DIY to help keep costs down, and we've still got quite a lot to do, but we're starting to reap the rewards in terms of comfort. House feels really great now, and hopefully will all be worth it in the long run. We could have phased the project. Harry gave some really interesting insights into phasing and thinking about what order you do things in. This can really help to break things down and manage disruption and cost. We did consider this, but regardless, it's still so important to take a whole house approach and plan the wider package of work. And lastly, I can't stress how valuable it was to take the time to survey and plan. It really pays off for briefs and specifications to be sufficiently detailed when you're actually undertaking works. The risks of rushing in, doing works in a piecemeal fashion include maladaptation, where measures installed might cause more harm than benefit, wasted time, money, and carbon. I'm going to end on a quote from William Morris, who's the founder of the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings. And he said in relation to old buildings that we are only trustees for those who come after us. Now, this sentiment's always had a huge impact on me in my career, and it feels that it can be applied just as much, if not even more emotively, given the current climate change emergency in a retrofit context. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about the project, it features as a case study in Historic England's Heritage and the Environment document published in 2020, which explores the key aspects affecting England's natural and built environments and the relationships that exist between them, with a specific focus on carbon emissions. And here are some links, including the document I just mentioned and the retrofit webinar that includes Harry's more technical presentation on the project, as well as a few others. Thank you very much for listening.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. That is just so useful. I think as we all begin to think about, well, some people are more advanced on this journey than certainly I am, but as we all begin to think about these things more seriously, it's just the greatest thing is hearing about other people's experience, because really, if one can multiply those stories coming to us all, it just really does give people courage, I think. So thank you very much. Now we're running about 3 minutes or a little bit, 5 minutes over time. So we're going to take a 10-minute break or just less than 10 minutes. If we can be back here at 8:10, that would be really good. So if you need to go to the loo or get a drink or something like that, do that. And then we look forward to seeing everybody back for the panel discussion. Sorry, for Councillor Louise and other talks, and then the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a good short break. We're just going to wait for a few more people to get back after the break, but we have 2 more presentations for you. The next 2 presentations are going to be relatively quick, so I hope you made the most of that deep dive into retrofit. It was definitely a lot of information, definitely a lot of discussion there. I can see in the chat about different materials, different solutions. So you can understand the complexity that goes into this project and why it might be beneficial to have an expert on board supporting you through this. But we will have 2 more presentations, which will bring us to around 8:35 p.m. and then we're going to jump straight into the panel discussion at the end. If you have questions that have been brewing over the break, please pop them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on the chat so that we can ask those questions in the panel discussion at the end. So, Julia, should we go ahead and get started again? I think you're on mute.
Yes, great. Thanks again to Sarah. And I think, Nadia, you're now going to introduce Councillor Louise, who's going to speak about the public sector retrofit efforts in Lewisham, really to give a context for where private homeowners and landlords fit in that picture.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. So we're really glad to have Councillor Louise Krupski giving some of her time. I know she's very, very busy, as you'll hear. She has a lot of commitments to retrofit in Lewisham Council. So just to give some background, Councillor Croxbegee is involved in the work of Lewisham Council to tackle climate change through Retrofit, as she is currently the chair of both the Housing Retrofit Task and Finish Group and also the Sustainable Development Select Committee. She's got a good knowledge of planning issues through her position on the planning committee and is the councillor for Rushy Green as a member of the Labour and Cooperative Party. So I'm going to hand over to Councillor Louise, and I will just try and find your slides for you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you for that opening introduction, because it means that I don't have to do my first paragraph, which is great. So thank you very much. Okay, so this is obviously me. This is my details. So if any of you want to contact me about the work that we're doing in Lewisham, then please obviously feel free to contact me by email. So can I have slide 2, please? So in 2019, Lewisham Council agreed a motion which declared that we were in a climate emergency and called the council to act in pretty much any way it could to push us to carbon neutrality by 2030. I seconded this motion and have worked hard throughout my first political term on this agenda. Recently, the council changed the way our scrutiny system works to introduce what are called task and finish groups. These groups look at individual issues which cut across all areas of the council to find ways to improve our services or take on a particularly pressing challenge. I saw this as an opportunity to grapple with a single aspect of the climate crisis. Having spoken to our brilliant climate crisis officers, Martin O'Brien and Emma Bushell, to check with them on which area to attack first, the overwhelming issue of the day was housing retrofit, and thus the Housing Retrofit Task and Finish Group was born. Can I have the next slide, please? Nadia? No, thanks. Martin illustrated the scale of the problem to me by explaining that we need to retrofit 80% of our housing stock. He did a rough calculation, and if we started today, we would have to completely retrofit 28 houses per day until the 31st of December 2030, with no holidays or weekends. This conversation happened in April this year, and we have not, to my knowledge, retrofitted any social housing stock yet. And while there may be some housing retrofit done in the private sector that we do not know about, we are certainly falling way behind. And that number of 28 houses per day will have climbed significantly since then. So I have to say, break and say that I am absolutely delighted that there are so many people at this meeting today who are genuinely interested in retrofitting their own houses, because this 28 per day includes privately owned homes as well as the social housing that we need to do in Lewisham Council. Martin was also eager to press on me the importance of how housing retrofit needs to be done urgently to tackle fuel poverty in our borough. And I noticed that was one of the concerns that came up in the chat earlier, so I was delighted to see that. Our work could not be timelier with the collapse of the smaller gas providers and the inevitable stratospheric rise in energy prices. It's important to remember too that electricity at some point will become cheaper than gas. And at that point, those who are the poorest in our community, living in traditional homes with no retrofit, will stand to lose the most. And we could even see a rise in the death rate caused by fuel poverty. We therefore have an urgent task to ensure that all our social housing stock is retrofitted as quickly as possible. The Task and Finish Group are working hard to determine the barriers to this work and how to get all our housing providers match fit so that they are ready and prepared to use grants of any kind to do as much work as they can when it comes online. And as most of you will know, there is very, very little government funding available for any of this kind of work. But what we're concerned about in the Retrofit group is that all our housing providers are absolutely ready, that they understand what needs to be done, that they've done the research that they need to do, and they also understand how they're going to get that work done in terms of contractors and people out in the building sector who can help. So Lewisham Council, as you probably realise, is not responsible for the private stock of housing in the borough. But we do recognise our responsibility to be agents of change and help everyone, including private homeowners and landlords, to get to the 2030 target. We are, of course, first and foremost concentrating on our social housing stock, but we also hope that by doing so, we will galvanise the private sector, which will create the much needed retrofit businesses to work on private homes. Can I have slide 4, please? One area we are particularly interested in is how we can speed up the process of skilling up the labour force. We have heard time and time again in our evidence sessions about the lack of trained retrofit assessors, retrofit coordinators and retrofit providers who must work to incredibly high standards set by the new regulations to ensure that the work done on our residents' homes is fit for purpose and does not cause them further issues with damp and condensation caused by shoddy cowboy work. And I, you know, as a homeowner myself, I'm sure that there are lots of you out there who have been desperately badly affected by shoddy workmanship. We have several times, and it's cruel and it's horrible. And you know, it's really vital that you find people who really absolutely know what they're doing. So we need proper accreditation and we need proper courses available to our young people to get trained in this area. To this end, we're asking how we can work with our colleges, Goldsmiths University, London South Bank University and private training providers to upskill our labour force, providing the necessary qualifications to keep this skill base within Lewisham. We're not just looking at school leavers, but also our existing traders who need to understand the new world they will be operating in so they do not get left behind. One of my many fears about housing retrofit is that large national companies will be formed which specialise in retrofit and swallow up the market, taking away this valuable economic activity away from Lewisham. By keeping things local, we can do some real good, both in retrofitting to a high standard and providing much needed skills and employment, which will feed into our local economy. This is not to say that I would not welcome good quality companies of any kind ready to do this urgent work. But if we can create a local Green New Deal in Lewisham, this would be much more preferable. In terms of conservation areas, which you are interested in tonight, can I have the next slide actually, please? This next slide shows a road in Sydenham, which is, I think these are the Christmas houses, which are absolutely beautiful and very consistent typography down the street. In terms of these areas, and the strong message we've heard from our officers in our research meetings with them is that there needs to be a focus on fabric first, which basically means looking after the building itself and doing as much as you possibly can before thinking about energy generation. Doing all the things you can do easily: loft insulation, underfloor insulation, ensuring glazing is airtight as possible, and replacing window units with double glazed, high quality wooden units if possible. This clearly doesn't go far enough, but if all homes in conservation areas were to do this work, we would save huge amounts of carbon quickly and relatively inexpensively. As you all know, there is a difficult balance to be had between ensuring that we are not leaking carbon and powering our homes as efficiently as possible without losing the historic aesthetic quality of our streets and houses, which we call home. Looking at this picture, it's difficult to see how external insulation would not radically alter the aesthetic of this street. And it may only be possible to apply internal wall insulation with some loss of internal floor space. And I won't go into any more detail about that because you've all already heard fantastic expert speakers on this who know an awful lot more about it than I do. But to help this process, you need clear advice, and this needs to be available to all residents who live in older homes and conservation areas about what they can do and the stages towards complete retrofit. So can I have slide 6, please? Through our research, we have discovered that Westminster Council, and it was interesting to hear Harry quote from them as well earlier in his talk. I think they're doing some excellent work on this. So Westminster Council have produced an excellent supplementary planning document which details all the steps which can be done with older historic buildings towards complete retrofit. And we would like to see a similar document available in Lewisham. We're also looking at the possibility of updating our supplementary planning document on outhouses and extensions to ensure residents get best advice at this critical time in their home's development, to ensure as many residents as possible get the message that insulation and power generation are just as important as a new kitchen or bathroom. We are also looking at the current local plan to see if there are any ways to strengthen our hand locally to encourage retrofit at any point of change in a building's remodelling. These documents could offer advice and direction, but we can't go as far as suggesting specific builders or contractors, as this could lead us into some potential legal dark waters. We're also beginning to explore the idea of whether we could employ a borough housing retrofit assessor who could not only work for the smaller housing associations, that's a real mouthful, on our social housing stock, but also be available commercially to private owners and landlords to assess what should be done to a house and in what order. But it's important to understand that as a scrutiny committee, we can only recommend to our Mayor and Cabinet what we think should be done, and none of these ideas have been firmed up or costed yet. We are at the stage where we have gathered a significant amount of evidence and are now considering our recommendations. So none of what I've said this evening has a firm commitment to it, but I wanted to give you a flavour of what we are considering at the moment. Can I have slide 7, please? So through our reading and hearing from expert witnesses, we have been told repeatedly that the scale of the issue is so vast and the funding issue so difficult that we won't achieve our goals without good collaboration. To this end, we're continuing to work with partners, strengthening our relationships with organisations such as CELSI and Retrofit Works, another very good not-for-profit company working in this sector, who are so well placed to help our residents complete this vital work. We've just entered into an exciting agreement with Southwark and Lambeth, whereby we are sharing a member of staff to look at skills development across the borough, across the 3 boroughs. And Lewisham Homes have been working closely with the GLA to maximise the bid they could apply for in the first round of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is a massive national fund to support the retrofit of social housing. And we are hoping to help our other social housing providers make the most of this in the second round. So can I have slide 8, please? As part of our work, as the Retrofit committee, we're doing a small consultation piece to find out opinions from residents, and it would be incredibly useful if you were all to take part. The consultation will be on the consultation hub, and the the address of that is there. So if you've got a pen and paper, if you could just quickly note that down, that would be amazing. And that will be available from the 12th of November. Obviously, the more responses to that we get, the better, and it really will help, as you know, evidence from our residents is just as important as from all our experts. We're also going to be holding some small evidence sessions with residents, and I think that Nadia is going to be sending out the information about those when we get the dates set for that, and we would love to have some volunteers to have a chat about retrofit in those sessions if you're interested in taking part. But that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting to find out what your local council is up to. I'm going to save questions for later when we have the open discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was really, really insightful, I have to say. It's very impressive to see how much Lewisham are looking into this, and that they have dedicated sort of the resource of your team to look at this aspect of sustainability. And I think it's fair to say it's a little bit more than other councils in the local area have done. But we definitely want to keep the momentum going there. And of course, we will send everyone links to details on how to keep up with this work and the surveys and consultations that will be coming out soon. Just conscious of time. Thanks again to Louise for that. So we're going to jump straight into the next presentation, which is from my colleague Dominic. Dominic is a master's graduate in environmental architecture and energy studies, and he currently works on the Future Fit Homes project as a retrofit coordinator, offering advice to both homeowners and landlords who are working on retrofit projects of their own. And also works very closely with our fuel poverty alleviation team, supporting people who are in vulnerable situations to get out of fuel poverty and access the support that is available to them. He's got a keen interest in all aspects of sustainable living, and he has recently decided to go vegan as well. Good for you, Dominic. So I will hand over to Dominic. If you'd like to share your slides, and if you have any issues, let me know.
Yeah, hello everyone. I did vegan for a year and then I gave up, sorry.
Well, it's good to try. You've done more than me.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that, thumbs up.
That's great.
Okay, so it's getting a bit late in the day. You've had a lot of information to absorb. I'm going to go a bit left field. And I'm going to try and, so I think some of the points that I'm kind of going to get you to think about are already coming up. There's just been a bit of chat in the boxes about the conservation officers and giving different advice and maybe being a barrier to getting work done, and that kind of ties into what I'm going to try and say. So first of all, I think we do all have to kind of maybe reassess our idea of what is beautiful. What do we want to conserve? What is beautiful now? What is going to be beautiful to someone in 50 years' time if we carry on going down the path? What is beautiful to us is, I think, is going to be a very different story for them. I've been asked to talk about renewables. I'm going to keep this very brief because there's a whole level of expertise out there. Some of the people have been on today that the knowledge base is incredible. So just for renewables, just some very, very kind of basic, I realize there's some people that are really deep into retrofit, some people just at the beginning. So just a couple of pointers. So solar PV, photovoltaic to produce electricity. For your project, it's going to depend on your roof space. It's going to depend on if you've got south-facing roof. Obviously, the plan in a conservation area, that is something that they do vary from each council, each borough. So you have to speak to your planning officer and your conservation officer about that. Electric vehicles are going to be a big part of the future. They're already coming in. So solar PV, is the perfect renewable for electric vehicles. Solar thermal, another great renewable technology, depends on how much space you've got on your roof. The main thing I would be thinking about if you're going down the solar thermal route is how much water do you need? And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. Heat pumps, we can't move for hearing about heat pumps at the moment. I'm not going to go into it. You can research those. But what I would say is, I would reaffirm what was said in the last webinar, that a heat pump is not going to work in an old Georgian house that doesn't have any insulation. It's not going to work. You have to insulate first. You have to look at the fabric first. You will have to resize your radiators. A gas boiler can heat a small radiator to an incredible heat. It can heat your house. A heat pump can't do that. You will need bigger radiators. Heat pumps combine really well with underfloor heating. And obviously the other important factor that's come up recently is that the government are going to give a £5,000 voucher. We don't know the details of the scheme, but that's going to start in April. But if you think of it in terms of your 50-50, whether to go down the heat pump route, that could be something that might sway you, because then you've got £5,000 to spend on the insulating your house. At the moment, the only things that are available is the renewable heat incentive. So this is for heat pumps, solar thermal and biomass. This is going to end in March 2022. So if you're at the beginning of a project, it's probably going to be too late for you for this. The details are on the government website of how it works, how to apply for it. The latest information from the government through the heat and building strategy is that they're going to replace the RHI with something called the Clean Heat Grant, which is going to start in April 2022. It's going to be for 2 years, and it's a paltry sum of 100 mil going towards that. So we're hoping we're going to get a bit more detail. We're hoping they're going to expand it a bit more, but at the moment, that's all the information that's available. What I would say about renewables, obviously in the space of 15 minutes, I haven't really got time to go into any more detail, but every project's going to be different. It's going to depend on your property. The three systems that I've listed above are all great. They're all great sources. And, you know, if we want to cut down CO2, we have to go down the renewable source. And where you can do it, you know, I'd be banging on my planning officer's door saying, look, what's more important? Okay, so we've had a couple of case studies on here as well, and I've just put at the bottom that case studies are actually priceless, especially for, you know, for information about your local area. Talk to your neighbours, talk to the other people on this group, talk to the people that are halfway through a project, all the way down, just starting a project. They are going to be able to inform you far better than anyone else. Okay. Very briefly on conservation areas. I mean, most of you, I'm imagining from what I'm gathering from what people are putting in the chat and what people are saying, probably this is a bit basic and you know it already, but every conservation area has a Article 4 direction. You can look this up and it will give the information about your particular area. They're all different. Someone's shaking their head. You can put me right on this if you like. But my general approach to this is that we are in a climate emergency. And I think, sorry, someone's going to speak.
Not every conservation area has an Article 4 direction.
Okay, right, okay, thank you. For those that have, you can look them up and read them. And I guess if they haven't, you will have to contact your planning officer from the council. I just took a little bit of blurb out of the Ashburnham Triangle, which is in Greenwich. This is just to give an example of the sort of thing that you can read in one of these guideline packs. I think, you know, the overall logic is going to be, if you want to make drastic changes to the front of your house, you're going to come up against barriers. And I would probably say, as a retrofit coordinator, I would actually be considering internal wall insulation as a possibility in a conservation area at the front of your house. At the back of your house, it might be a different story. You might be able to put on external wall insulation. Okay. Next slide. So I think it was Harry that mentioned earlier on the phrase Exemplary Terrace. This is a terrace in Moss Side, Manchester. All those houses, well, nearly all the ones that were part of the project are B rated. The house you can see on the right is my house. I used to live in Manchester. This was a really good example of, it was actually funded by Manchester City Council, but they more or less bought up 4 or 5, I think it was 5 terrace streets, and they offered, where they couldn't buy the houses, they offered the residents the option of being involved in the project. And this was a fantastic example of bringing costs down by doing it on bulk. So my house, these houses, we have internal wall insulation at the back and at the front. We've got external wall insulation at the back, which you can't see. Double glazing throughout, underfloor insulation. We had gas boilers, but this house would be ready for a heat pump. My bills were about 200 quid a year. I barely put the heating on. It's an, you know, it was an incredible difference to what a standard 2 up, 2 down terrace housing would be. And as you can see, the fittings inside, the way it was done, you didn't know you were in a eco house. But I was very interested by this idea of, because obviously you all communicate, and I think this idea of getting together and maybe trying to do projects together, 2 or 3 neighbours, 5 or 6 neighbours, finding out who wants to do it. It's a really, really important way forward. And it's something that I think, you know, we as a nation, we should be looking at, but it's obviously very difficult. Okay. So when in the chat earlier on as well, when Nadia was asking people, that I think the 2 biggest concerns were for people doing retrofit was, where do I start? And I can't afford it. So I'm going to throw something out there, which may be a bit controversial, but excuse me, I've got a cough. I think, you know, if you're living in a conservation area, your house is probably pretty valuable. One option you can do is a kind of equivalent to equity release. If you don't want to, you know, if you haven't got the available money to just pay for this kind of work, I think there are options. We at Celsey, we had a fantastic talk from a lady from the London Rebuilding Society, and she told us about, you can go on their website and you can look into it, see if it's appropriate for you. It's actually aimed at people, kind of more elderly people that can't afford to do repairs. But she said the concept of energy efficiency can fall into the category of what they are proposing to do. And I'm not a financial expert, but basically the payment for the works comes out of, there's no upfront cost. It comes out of the value of your property. And what she explained to us was that in most cases, you will find that if you put 50,000 in to doing energy efficiency measures, whatever they might be, your property after you've done the works will probably be worth more than that. And I think we're beginning to see the valuation of properties. People are beginning to think about, you know, what are my bills going to be? And it is beginning to affect house kind of prices. In the previous slide, there was a few houses that weren't project, and I think this was 10 years ago this was done. I think that if you look up the values now, you'll find the ones that aren't part of the project are probably worth, I mean, these houses are £100,000. It's not London, it's Moss Side, Manchester. But they're probably worth about £10,000 to £20,000 less than the ones that were part of the project. So, I mean, it might be a bit controversial, but I kind of think, you know, if you're sitting on a resource that's as valuable as it is, I think it is worth contemplating, you know, maybe kind of changing the mindset and trying to find a way of committing, because spending 5,000 or 10,000 on a house, you know, as complicated as these old houses is not gonna, it's not gonna provide the solution. So we have to be thinking bigger, and there are opportunities out there, I think, available. Okay, so I've rushed through. I think that the level of expertise amongst, you know, the other people on here is so high. I think talking to each other, you can probably find, you know, you can look into all the technical solutions. It does seem to be they are out there. It's just a matter of, can we afford to pay for them? Can we find contractors, installers good enough to carry out the works? These are all factors. Going back to my original slide and coming back to this one, I just kind of want, you know, people to take a deep breath and think about when I walk down the street and I see, you know, uninsulated houses, if it was billowing smoke coming out of those houses, would they look so attractive to you? So you know, I'm just trying to, my point I want to try and get across is, and this is for councillors, it's for conservation officers, planning officers, I just think, you know, it's fantastic that Lewisham Council have making commitments, you know, as we've heard, and they're taking it more seriously. I used to work at Greenwich Council in the waste department, and it's sad to say for me that no one was really considering it as a climate emergency. I think things are changing now, and it's really great to see that Lewisham are going that way. And I think we should all think about it ourselves and just go in with a different mindset. And it's not like, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. It's like, well, how can I persuade this person that what I'm doing is more important than, you know, the barriers that they're putting up? Okay, I think that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for that very real and bringing us back down to a reminder that we are actually in a climate emergency, and what is most important to us, and what does make a beautiful home, and how we frame our mindset around that. So just for the interest of the people that were interested to find out a bit more about renewable energy, we did do a whole webinar on renewable energy and smart homes, and I've put the link in the chat if you're interested to explore those different technologies in much more technical detail. But there have been a few questions dropped into the chat section. If you have any more, please go ahead. I don't think we're going to have time to answer all of the questions, but I would like to welcome all of our speakers back so we can kick off with the panel discussion. And the first question that I have for everyone, very relevant, and it has been asked in the chat a lot, is how can people actually work out where they start with retrofit? And for those of you that have done retrofits of your own homes, where is it that you started? What would you recommend? Perhaps Sarah or Harry can kick us off with this one.
Well, Harry's probably got a more holistic overview, having talked to many more clients and seen many more projects. But for us, where we started was the drive to really want to do something and want to upgrade our house and make it a comfortable, livable and warm and enjoyable place to live that didn't emit all sorts of energy that we knew we were pumping out from all the gaps and holes and inefficient sort of fabric that we had. We also, for us, it was a real learning experience as well. We wanted to sort of improve our own knowledge and share that locally. But I suppose, where did we start? It took us about 1.5 years before we even got through to any real planning of physical work. It was a lot of thinking through everything, doing a lot of research. I would really recommend that being the first step for everybody, is just looking and making use of what's available out there in terms of guidance. There is lots of very simple step-by-step guidance on how to get started. Some of it's quite technical, some of it is less technical, and you know, there'll be a point where you may want to engage the professional support and advice as well. Yeah, Harry may have a wider perspective on that, but that's where we started.
Yeah, I can build on that. So I think it's worth pointing out that it's really, really common that a lot of people without much knowledge of retrofit and how buildings perform is that they jump to a technology. And, you know, the number of times I hear people say, you know, I've done an eco thing and I'm going to get underfloor heating, or I'm going to get an air source heat pump. And I just thought it'd be worth, I mean, it's been said a number of times, but let's just not forget that this mantra of fabric first is incredibly important. If we don't retrofit a house and we stick in an air source heat pump, it's going to be using an enormous amount of electricity and it's going to cost a huge amount of money. So just remember that, you know, the fabric first means reducing the heat load of the building. So that's also a really important thing. And then the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has got these 3 mantras that they use. So the first is fabric first. The second is worst first. So, you know, if you're looking to do something and you don't have any insulation in your roof and you have a cold roof space, it is a very simple, quick win to get 300 millimeters or something like that of insulation in your loft space. It's a very simple thing to do, and there's some great products out there. that can actually allow you to raise your loft deck up and put some low emissions boarding, chipboard on top. EC1 is the good one to look out for to get low emissions, and then you can still have your storage space, but you can be nice and cozy. When I did that in my own house right now, we felt the difference overnight. We did it during the winter, and it was just like literally pulling a duvet over you. So, you know, that would be a sort of really simple, quick win. And unfortunately, my answer, I'll tell you the third thing about the social housing decarbonisation fund in a second, but my answer is usually a bit boring, and I did touch on it earlier on. It's that where somebody wants to stick in a bit of kit, I actually say, sort your drains out, or repoint your chimney breast, or cover your chimney pots and stop rainwater getting down, or repoint your walls, you know. You know, and those are really critical parts of our buildings. You know, windowsills that are sloping backwards and they're starting to rot windowsills. There are so many elements of buildings that are not looked after. So I do think that those important elements of building maintenance, they actually help retrofit. And if you don't know that much about how the U value of a wall works, well, if it's wet and it's a solid brick wall, it's going to perform a lot worse. If it's nice and dry and the repointing is in good condition, it will perform better. I'm not saying that that's a reason to not install insulation. We still need to do that, but it's very important that the building fabric works well. So the third mantra that they use in the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is least regrets. And a better way to describe that is I use the phrase performance lock-in. So let's think about some works you're doing to your house. If you're replacing a bathroom, you're going to be spending quite a bit of money on your bath, on your plumbing, on your tiling, on your window, on all the finishes in that room. And you're not likely to revisit it for another 10 or 15 years. So there is, I mean, hopefully longer, yeah? But there is an opportunity at that point to retrofit some insulation onto that wall and to get it in. And so I call that performance lock-in, and the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund calls it least regrets. So don't go and stick in a very average, not so airtight double glazed window when you could do something a lot better, a very, very good double glazed window or a triple glazed window. Just don't lock in poor performance, because it's going to be there for a long time. So maybe over to the next person.
That's great. And Dominic and Louise, you know, we've talked about this concept of getting a survey done. What solutions are there out there for that at the minute that you're aware of?
Who is that question?
I mean, there isn't, and I don't think there's anything that the council provides for that kind of thing. I think, you know, obviously, I mean, a private surveyor. I mean, I really don't. I'm afraid that's not really where my area of expertise. But there certainly isn't anything that the council currently provides. But one of the things that, as I said in my speech, is that the Retrofit group is looking at is the possibility of, you know, having, because there's this problem of trust. Because this is, a lot of these skills are relatively kind of, they're not new actually. Some of the concepts are old, but some of the skills are new, and I think there's a lack of trust within the public and wariness of just like calling someone and asking them to come and do a survey or whatever. So one of the things we're trying to look at is whether there is any possible way that we can have someone who is actually employed by the council who can work with our social housing providers to do some of that work, but also possibly be available to private homeowners to be able to use on, you know, they don't have to pay for that, but at least it would be someone who would be trusted within the community. So that's something that we're looking at in the Housing Retrofit group to kind of possibly suggest as a recommendation. But we don't have anything like that at the moment, unfortunately.
It's a really interesting concept. Dominic, any more points on this one?
Yeah, so part of Future Fit Homes, we actually do free half-hour calls where people can just give us a rough idea of their house, you know, and the makeup and what they're contemplating, what measures they're contemplating doing, and we can give them a bit of advice, you know, about kind of what direction to go down. And then if they want to take it a bit further, we can do a whole house assessment where we would come round and do an RDSAP assessment, and then enter the data we get from the house. So we would assess, you know, all the different building fabric, the boiler, etc. And then we can put that in a bit of software, and it will suggest the best measures that are appropriate for that property. And then we can kind of put those into a plan for that house. That would kind of be the first step, I would say.
Great, thank you. And we had another sort of a bit more technical question. I think it was aimed at Harry from Malcolm, and he was asking, in the listed buildings that you'd worked on, how did you manage to install internal wall insulation without damaging the picture rails, dado rails, skirting boards, etc.? Or were they removed and duplicated and replaced? Or how did you get through that?
Well, as Sarah described in her home, you know, you usually encounter a range of conditions. So you have some areas where you have cornices that are intact, and some areas where they're just not there anymore. And so wherever we were working in a room with a really beautiful cornice, we were sizing the depth of insulation. We were using aerogel insulation, and we were specifying it to be bespoke to that space, so that as it rose up and met the cornice, it wouldn't damage that junction of the cornice to the wall. So it was always a kind of bespoke situation. And in a few situations, we did carefully lift existing skirting boards out and then replace them back over that insulation. So we would lime parge the wall behind them, or put the aerogel insulation behind them, and then put the skirting back over the top. So it was kind of quite. I mean, I have to say that there's a lovely intersection of skill and love and care between heritage craftsmen and deep retrofit expertise, because actually it's about loving materials and about putting them in a responsible way and about understanding building physics. So yeah.
Okay, great. That's really interesting. So quite an intricate process to do that, but it's the love and attention that makes these buildings. So just moving on to a different topic, which there's been some discussion about in the chat. The sort of guidance around conservation areas, specifically with regards to conservation officers. Is there clear guidance as to when retrofit should or shouldn't be allowed? And how is there any support out there for further training for conservation officers or people that work in the planning departments in this space, to get them sort of looped in on new technologies and changes to planning and bits like that? This is a question that's kind of thrown at everyone. I know that Joanna Eccleston, I think, is in the audience as well. Feel free to jump in here, Joanna.
Yes, hi. I'm a conservation officer at Lewisham. I think there's a couple of things to say here. One is that as conservation officers, we're used to looking at, or we're used to taking a very long-term view of buildings and wanting to make sure that their fabric and their details and what makes them special survives into the future. And this is partly what's beautiful about them. And it's also, in many cases, their fabric themselves. So we need to be really careful about what we do to them to prevent unexpected damage or unintended consequences. So that's just a sort of basic approach that we take. And that would be one that deep retrofitters take as well. And I think Harry mentioned that in his last comment. You know, we take the same sort of care and attention to the implications of what we do to historic buildings. The next thing to say about varied advice that people might get from different conservation officers, and I think partly this is because there is no firm guidance, because most of what we do is based on assessing significance of heritage assets, looking at what people are wanting to do, and then trying to find the best approach to it. So there's not a general rule. There'll be a weighing up of information, justification, options, measuring harm, understanding significance. So there never is a one-size-fits-all answer to these things. There might be cases where, say, it's a simple question as to whether something needs planning permission or not, and hopefully, or listed building consent, hopefully you'd be getting a consistent answer across all councils. But I do think even there, I mean, looking at some of the comments about whether solar PV needs planning permission or not, I think even there is interpretation of the government's general permitted development order. So I understand it is difficult. I usually refer people to Historic England's guidance, and which talks about whole house retrofit, and suggest people go through that process of really considering their options, how things will impact on their buildings, what they're really wanting to achieve out of it. So I think that's what I do. I expect a lot of other conservation officers do that as well, but it is an area that's obviously developing a lot. Interest in it is ramping up a lot now, and we're in conversation with Historic England about what guidance can be put out there. And Councillor Krupski has mentioned Westminster's SPD on retrofit, and that would be amazing if Lewisham could produce one of those as well. So we want to help people as much as we can, but we have to be careful about what we're doing to these buildings. And the government requires that we give great weight. It's in legislation that we give great weight to the conservation of historic buildings. So this is what we have to weigh up against retrofit. But it's not that we don't want to do it, just we have to be careful about how we do it.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thank you very much. Was anyone else wanting to add a point there? I think I've cut someone off.
I was just going to say that I completely echo everything that Joanna's just said and agree with it wholeheartedly. Every building is different and needs a different approach, and the key to that is the assessment and understanding and information gathering stage for any project. And even within a building, you may have, as Harry mentioned, the need to take a different approach in different areas if you've got significant features that need to be preserved, and it is possible to take a different approach in different areas. So just to really emphasize it, there isn't a one size fits all approach, and the reason you get different answers on things from different conservation officers is that every building is different. There isn't a general kind of approach that can be applied to every historic building, and that is why you need to understand significance and understand the building that you're dealing with. So that's the crucial stage in my view.
All right, that's a brilliant way to round up, I think. I'm afraid we don't have any more time to get to the rest of the questions, but if you have an urging, burning question that you want to get across to our speakers, just drop us an email and we will send it out to them so they can get back in touch with you. But for now, thank you to all of the panelists and speakers for such great insight into this space. And I'm going to pass back to Julia to finish off the event for today. If Julia is still there.
She's on the mute. Yeah.
Thank you to all our speakers, and the range of insights and practical guidance, highly researched technical advice and data. It's been a dense evening, and it's really clear that embarking on a retrofit project is a real learning journey. But that actually, I think the insight for me is that one really has to remind oneself about the unglamorous things like drainage and everything that really needs looking at. And if one is thinking about retrofit, really that's the first place to start. And then obviously going on the much longer and more considered journey that people have gone into tonight. But potentially it could be a very exciting and hugely constructive adventure, really, and certainly giving oneself a sense that one is actually doing something in this very dire picture we have ahead of us, but keeping a hold on what we consider as home and the things that we value about our historic buildings. Funding is certainly a challenge, but individuals can begin with relatively simple measures, and let's hope that policies are changing to address funding of wider adaptation, but it's clear that we can't wait for that to happen. But you may have read recently that Glasgow may be showing the way, and the city recently announced, amongst a range of other measures, a 10 billion programme to retrofit around 3 million homes of varying tenures. So not just social housing over the next 10 years. And it would be great if they give a certain sort of oomph behind other councils and indeed countries to get a bit more active in this policy area. And also it'd be great to highlight further and grow Lewisham's leadership position in the space. And it's brilliant to see that you're forming alliances with Southwark and Lambeth and Greenwich, because really this issue of skills and workmanship and trusted workers is such a really, really serious one. And there's going to be a lot of cowboys bundling in there. So all hail to efforts to get those skills and accreditation really, really going. And also conservation areas and the idea of 2 or 3 houses getting together to try and get things happening at the same time would be really, really an exciting and community building, potentially, venture. So that's it. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for attending, for your donations, and thank you again to all our speakers. And finally, we'll be sending out a message with the recording, the slides, the chat, and links to other resources over the next week. And Future Fit Homes are exploring a number of other follow-up options, including an in-person surgery or surgeries locally, and we'll be in touch about that in due course. And finally, please get in touch if you'd be interested in helping taking conservation issues forward in the Brook Road area through membership of our society. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye, everybody.